All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about some sort of macro or broad scale issues related to research. So upon the completion of a research project, it's important to take a step back and take stock of what you've accomplished, whether it matters, and what to do next. So at this point, you should be, at the conclusion of your semester-long research project, be asking yourself some bigger issues. No matter what, whether you found significant results or not, you should definitely feel proud that you successfully conducted a research study. As you guys probably realized along the way, something as simple as creating an online survey takes a lot more effort, training, practice, and time investment than you might have expected. And it feels like if life were fair, putting all that hard work in should yield the results that you expected. But as you guys realize, even the best planned studies sometimes don't yield the results that you expected. So maybe your results are significant, maybe not. For the context of this class, of course, it doesn't matter, but it's always going to be disappointing when you put all that work in and don't get what you expect out of it. So it's okay when you don't find significant results. What does really matter is sort of how you frame your next steps. The kind of questions you could ask yourself upon the conclusion of a research project, whether you found significant results or not, is really, does this research matter to you? Is this really what you want to pursue? Do you care to take the next step and create another research project in the same vein? Another important question that's going to frame a lot of what I discuss in this lecture is the idea of, would you be able to recreate your study and find the same results, whether significant or not? I'm going to talk a lot about what is called the replication crisis in psychology right now. The idea is, if we want to do good quality scientific research, we want to make sure that our results are consistent. And so a new, relatively new push to recreate, replicate, and repeat psychology research has yielded a lot of inconsistent findings that the field in general is really being forced to grapple with. Another broad scale issue is the issue of generalization. I'm going to also talk about a somewhat systemic flaw in the field of psychology, whereby the field-wide sampling approach is quite biased. In doing so, we create results that are likely not quite as universally generalizable as we would have hoped. As with any issue, you need to interrogate the extent to which those issues matter to you. So your biased sampling, your inability to generalize universally, you do need to interrogate whether that matters to you. Do you think your research would be better served if it was focused on a specific sample? Whatever your answer is, it's important to interrogate these questions. So first I'm going to talk about this issue of replication. So a replication study is really what it sounds like. It's any research study that seeks to replicate or repeat a pre-existing research study. There's a few different approaches to replication that all have different purposes. One is what we call a direct replication. This is when you attempt to faithfully recreate exactly a previous research study. You use the same measures, you use the same approach, you attempt to recreate the same exact results. This might sound somewhat dull and uninteresting, and you're not wrong. To recreate exactly a previous study is not always the most interesting endeavor. But if you want to demonstrate that your research findings are consistent, a direct replication would be useful to serve that purpose. Some other approaches that would enable you to somewhat build upon or change your replication would either be your conceptual replication or replication plus extension. A conceptual replication is a replication study that seeks to find the same results, but with switched out measures. So it is a conceptual replication, but the exact scales that were used, the exact questions that were asked, are a little bit different. Maybe instead of the generalized anxiety scale, you just used a different measure of anxiety. Maybe you use an observational measure instead. You're measuring the same variables, you're looking for the same effect, you just switch out one measure for another. This way, you can see whether or not results hinge on the specific measurement choices from the first study, or if the effect more generally replicates when you use slightly different approaches for measurement. Replication plus extension, on the other hand, is when you do a direct replication, meaning that the study you're attempting to replicate is faithfully and exactly repeated, but you also add something else to it. You add a new outcome, a proposed mediator, a proposed moderator, a secondary dependent variable. Anytime you do a direct replication, but you tack something else on, that is a replication plus extension. So it might seem like replication research doesn't seem particularly sexy or interesting, and you're absolutely right. To just repeat something that has already been done, it doesn't feel that that gets us the really cool, explosive, novel scientific research we're hoping for. But part of moving science forward is not always doing the sexy, fun, new stuff. It's doing the hard work of making sure that what has already been done is good quality. We can only really trust scientific findings once they've been demonstrated at least a few times. Any single finding could reasonably, even if it's significant, be the result of a fluke. We really want to make sure that we are replicating research so that we can feel confident that our effects are legitimate. So replication research is actually really hard because it really takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of grunt work and it's not as interesting, but it really is in the service of making our science better quality. In terms of the push for more replication in science and in psychology, I'm going to walk you through a few examples of what I would consider good and poor responses among scientists in the field to issues of replication. So, this first article that I've linked here, Priming Replication in the Hardest Science, gets into a specific sub area of psychological research that has been hit by what we call the replication crisis. So briefly, I'm going to explain to you what the replication crisis is. I've now described to you replication studies. Now, within the past 20-ish years in the field of psychology, there was the beginning of a more massive push to systematically replicate psychological findings before they go to publication, or to replicate old classic studies to make sure they hold up. The quote unquote replication crisis was born out of the fact that upon this push for systematic replications, a lot of psychology's oldest and most classic findings that we teach all our intro psych students weren't replicated. The crisis is because we're then left asking ourselves, what's true? Were the classic studies true or were they bogus? Is there something wrong with the replication approach? It is to the detriment of the legitimacy of the field of psychology and the trust that people have in psychological science if we can't come to consistent conclusions about which of our results are legit. So, an example of a sub area bit of research that has been hit by the replication crisis is this priming subfield. So, priming research is any psychological research that has to do with subtle cues or stimuli that are meant to cause changes in behavior. So, if you're familiar with the apocryphal old story of the movie theater that very quickly and subliminally flashed Coca Cola advertisements in a movie theater and in doing so increased Coca Cola sales, that's one of the most famous fake or apocryphal stories in the vein of priming. But lots of psychology research has been able to demonstrate that subtle priming can actually change people's behavior. One of the most famous studies was John Bargh's classic study from, I believe, the 80s, where he found that by priming participants with words related to old age, by having them complete a crossword puzzle that contains some hit words like Florida and I don't know, bingo. I can't remember what the other hit words were, but they all had to do with old age. He found that participants that got the old age prime tended to walk more slowly down a hallway. What an interesting finding. Very subtle priming cues, it seemed, can have subtle effects on behavior. So, priming is meant to demonstrate that even if people are unaware of what's in their perceptual field and what's being exposed to them, they can have subtle changes in their behavior be the result. Here's the problem. The classic John Bargh finding that I just described to you, researchers attempted to replicate it within the past 10 years and were unable to do so. So the classic priming finding that I don't know about you guys, but I learned about all the way back in Intro to Psychology when I was in college. I don't know if I can believe that that particular finding is true. Now, interestingly, John Bargh himself, famous Harvard psychologist, he responded to this failed replication by having a conniption fit on his personal blog, personal professional blog, basically saying that the replication researchers did it wrong, that it was their failure of methodology, and that his finding was legit. In my opinion, he responded in a very immature way. He took the failed replication as a personal slight, as opposed to what it is, an attempt on the part of the replication researchers to solidify and enable us to have more faith in research findings. So, in my opinion, he responded in a way that I would not consider totally adaptive, healthy, or mature. The authors of this article, though, that I've linked here, they wrote an article specifically about these failed replications in the priming field. Basically, they owned up to the fact that priming effects might not always replicate. They did stand up for their research by saying that priming effects might be somewhat sensitive. They might be sort of difficult to pin down. It might not occur in all sample populations. So they did somewhat explain why they think the effects are still legit, but they might be a little bit more unreliable. But then they took the burden upon themselves. They said it does not make priming effects frivolous, but that priming researchers themselves must provide their own direct replications. So they identified the problem and they owned up to it. They explained what they think is causing the fluky replications, and they took the onus upon themselves to be their own replicators. Again, in my opinion, these researchers from this article are providing a much more nuanced, thoughtful, and mature, and ultimately helpful response to the replication crisis as it hit their own personal research. Here's where the replication crisis has led us down some sort of dodgy pathways that don't leave us with so many black and white concrete answers. So, an example of an area where the replication efforts have sort of led us down a pathway towards more as opposed to less confusion is the quote unquote facial feedback hypothesis. So, the facial feedback hypothesis, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that obviously feeling an emotion can cause you to express it, namely with a facial expression. The facial feedback hypothesis pitched that if you just have people put on a facial expression, it might ultimately change your mood or your emotion. So, to test this, they had people artificially adopt facial expressions by either holding a pencil in their lips, like this top picture, sort of simulating a frown, versus directing participants to hold a pencil in their teeth, simulating a smile. The people who sort of artificially adopted the smile tended to have outcomes like reporting that a comic strip was funnier as compared to these frowny faced people. Cool effect, right? Well, an initial replication attempt failed to demonstrate the veracity of the facial feedback hypothesis. Right? Problematic. Do we throw out the facial feedback hypothesis? Is it all bullshit? Or is it the replication that is inaccurate? When you have an initial classical finding and a failed replication, it's not necessarily the case that the old school finding is wrong. What we're left with is two competing and incongruent effects. The question becomes, how can we figure out what's true? Well, in this particular example, another group of scientists did a re-replication. They replicated the replication. Here's what ended up happening, and it did ultimately shed some light on the issue of the facial feedback hypothesis by demonstrating that sometimes effects aren't as simple as they appear. So the re-replication actually found that they were able to replicate the facial feedback hypothesis. What they did is they further scrutinized any differences they could figure out between the classic facial feedback publication and the replication attempt. What they found is that there actually was a key difference between those two studies. They found that in the classic study there was no video camera present, but that in the replication paper there was. They taped everyone because they wanted to be able to scrutinize those tapes after the fact. The researchers from the re-replication thought to themselves, maybe what caused the inconsistent finding was the fact that there was this distinction, the presence of a video camera. If you're paying attention, you might think to yourself, the video camera, if it can change the existence of an effect, it might be a potential moderator. So what the re-replicators did is they manipulated the presence of a video camera. They saw that it was a potential confound, and instead of just letting it be a confound, they manipulated it. In their re-replication, they had facial feedback as one of their independent variables, and they introduced a video camera being present as a second independent variable. In doing so, they found that video cameras actually moderated the ability of the facial feedback hypothesis to work. They found that without a video camera, facial feedback could change reported mood or emotion, but when the video camera was there, this effect was disrupted. So, in really closely scrutinizing what was different between the two studies, researchers were able to identify the key distinction, account for it, and in doing so, enable us to get a clearer picture of what this facial feedback phenomenon is about. It's not that the classic study or the replication was trash or inaccurate. It's just that they had a little difference. And by taking it into account, we now better understand what's going on. So again, in my opinion, this is how the replication crisis can help us. It helps us further understand the scientific results that we have so that we can feel more confident about them and understand them better. So overall, the replication crisis, it still sucks. Some research appears to be inconsistent. Some classic research appears to be bullshit. It's leading to a lot of attempts to figure out what's true. And it's just a sort of a painful place for the field of psychology to be in. I think that what comes out of this, though, can be really positive. There's now a lot of ways that psychologists have established that we can deal with replication issues from the get-go. We want our research going forward to be of the best possible quality so that we don't experience replication issues going forward. So any of these strategies, I'm going to put them under the umbrella of what we call being a good science citizen. Because really, all of the best strategies that go into dealing with replication issues and really cutting them off at the pass is going to just be part and parcel of doing good quality science. So things like being open and honest, that's something that if you're thinking about doing good science, right, having your research be publicly verifiable is one of them. So how does this bear out in the replication crisis world? Open science is a push within the field of psychology and science generally to make your data sets available to everyone. You don't just publish your findings and keep your data set locked up. When you get your publication published, there would be a link at times where anyone who's reading your article can go ahead and download your data set and reanalyze and take a look. That makes the science more publicly available and more democratic. Another strategy is this push for what's called pre-registration. Pre-registration is something that more and more journals are offering, whereby basically in advance of the research happening, you go to a journal and you suggest a hypothesized study, and the journal, if they accept it, will commit to publishing your results whether you find significant effects or not. So basically, we're trying to cut off the issue of the file drawer problem, right? By and large, only significant results throughout the history of psychology have been published in journals. That leads to this overwhelming bias whereby there's likely to be file drawers, metaphorically for the most case. Now most of our data is stored on computers, but there's just a multitude of data sets that scientists have with null findings that never get seen anywhere. The bias for significant findings might be part of why we're dealing with a lot of replication issues. So pre-registration is an attempt to get all findings on a topic, whether significant or not, available to people. Another strategy, replicate your own study. Before you go to publish your manuscript, at least replicate it a couple times. Throw in a direct replication. Do a replication plus extension. Replicate your own study so you feel confident about it before you go to publication. Anytime you encounter a failed replication, either in your own research or other research you're reading about, don't just discount the first finding or the replication. Think about how they're different. As mentioned in the facial feedback example, sometimes a failed replication is due to a genuine difference between the two studies. So you can evaluate and interrogate any details that might have changed. If a study truly does not replicate and you can't identify a potential confound that could account for the changes, one of those studies needs to be a fluke. So if studies really don't replicate, ultimately you do have to rethink and potentially throw out the initial fluky finding. Some other things that a good scientist should do to be the best and most honest scientist you can be is to not engage in statistical chicanery and shadiness. So the term p hacking, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this term. Generally speaking, p hacking is sort of any attempt to force your data to be significant, even at the expense of legitimacy and statistical validity. So p hacking, a really basic example would be you start with a two-tailed hypothesis and it's not significant. You switch to one-tailed to see if you can get that p-value where you want it to be. P-hacking is a disservice to scientific validity because it's just trying to force the data to tell you what you want to hear. Good scientific research should have the data speaking for itself. If a result you are really banking on is non-significant, it's non-significant. You have to move on with your life. P-hacking is when a scientist does any statistical trickery to try and get the results they want. Obviously, you should avoid this, and most scientists do. But I can tell you that lots of high profile scientists and psychologists have been caught doing this sort of trickery, and it may be responsible for some issues with replication. So, p hacking is completely unethical, it's completely shady, and it undermines the validity of scientific research and our entire field. So, obviously, don't do it. Sufficiently large sample sizes. This is definitely something that is part of a modern push to improve the quality of our psychological research. If you read some old school studies, even going back probably prior to 15 or 20 years ago, really it was that recently, you see some studies with some absolutely abominably small and underpowered sample sizes. You might see an experiment with two conditions that had an n of 2 per condition, so an overall n of 20. That is so ridiculously small. So it's easier to find fluky findings if you have a really small sample size. So more and more researchers are trying to recruit larger samples to try and have better quality data. So you see researchers specifically dedicating space within their manuscript discussing why they recruited the sample size that they did and justifying the sample size that they ended up with. Meta-analysis, this is an approach that some researchers take. This is basically compiling a data set that puts together lots of pre-existing research. You might contact a bunch of researchers, collect their data set, and you smash it all into one big data set and you rerun the analyses all combined. This allows you to figure out whether or not the sort of bulk of the research on a similar topic appears to tell the same story. So you might be thinking to yourself, this all sounds like too much effort. Do we really care that much to make psychology that legitimate? I'm going to argue that A, yes, it matters. Um, the field of psychology really does study some really important things like prejudice and racism, things like attitudes towards science, trust and expertise, which is obviously very topical right now. It studies things like mental illness and appropriate treatments. I'm going to argue that it does matter. We can't treat psychology research as fluff where it really doesn't matter to do the right thing and put out good quality science. Putting out garbage psychology research can harm people, either by having poor quality findings go out there misleading people, but also by causing people to mistrust the field of psychology in general and to discount our expertise. Both of those outcomes, I think, are detrimental to health and well-being and the field of psychology. Also, talking about science more generally, putting out garbage research can cause some pretty drastic and deleterious societal outcomes. So, one example is one of the worst medical studies of all time. The now disgraced Andrew Wakefield, former doctor who had a study published in The Lancet where he studied a sample of, I think, like 12 young children, and he found that children who received the MMR vaccine tended to have more cases of autism. Now, I am here to tell you, if you don't know already, that study was bullshit. It was a ridiculously small sample size. He was caught falsifying some of his data. He misinterpreted correlation with causation, right? Just because we see autism symptoms appear at the same age that children tend to get the MMR vaccine does not mean they're causally linked. It just means they occur at a similar developmental stage. He didn't disclose that he had funding from the law firm representing parents who were trying to sue a pharmaceutical company because they thought that the vaccines gave their son autism. All of those things made this study a huge pile of bullshit. The study from the Lancet was retracted, and Andrew Wakefield lost his license to practice medicine. His one absolute flaming dumpster fire garbage research was a really important part of kicking off the explosion of the current anti vax phenomenon. He didn't start the anti vax trend, but he certainly put a lot of fuel to that fire. Now we're seeing explosions of previously basically eradicated disease. We're seeing cases of the measles go up. We are seeing so much of this lack of trust in medical expertise and in the efficacy of vaccines because this one douchebag wanted to get a little bit of recognition. He wanted to become famous. He wanted the money. He's anti vaccine for his own bullshit biased purposes. He's a terrible person. His one study here was absolute garbage. He has caused untold societal damage and death by helping perpetuate this anti scientific, anti vax phenomenon. So fuck him. He's a bad science citizen. He's still on the anti vax talk show circuit. He sucks. His research sucks. He is an asshole. And you shouldn't be an asshole. That's all I have to say about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about p hacking. As I mentioned, this is a very unethical approach to statistical analyses. And you might be thinking, who really does that? Who's going to falsify their data? Isn't that so wrong? Yeah, it is wrong, but I'm just going to give you one example. I was trolling Twitter as I do, looking for some inspiration for content for replication, various issues related to replication, and I found this one neuroscientist publish a screenshot on Twitter from the Ask Statistics subreddit. Now, that is the most internet inception-y thing I could probably ever show to you, but it is what it is. Basically, this researcher posted a screenshot from an individual who was in the Ask Statistics subreddit, basically asking for help p-hacking their research. So the subreddit post said that one of their variables was close to reaching significance, but it's not quite there, and they desperately need to do some bullshit transformation to make this variable hit significance. Basically, they were asking for help coming up with a bullshit justification for a completely unnecessary statistical transformation. That's p-hacking. That's using your knowledge of statistics to try and do something completely unnecessary to force the data to tell you the story that you want. That undermines the legitimacy of your effects. It's confusing as hell, right? If you were to read that article and you see this seemingly unnecessary statistical procedure, that's just going to make the whole thing seem a little bit more bullshit. So people who commented on the Twitter thread were basically like, yes, this is part of what's wrong with our approach to statistics in the sciences, and this was my particularly favorite response. A great question on a final exam would be statistically, methodologically, and spiritually, what's wrong with this picture? Well, statistically, statistics are supposed to help the data tell their story, not a tool to try and force it to tell the story that you're hoping to make. Methodologically, don't do unnecessary transformations. Science and analysis is supposed to be as concise as possible, so don't do unnecessary dumb stuff. Spiritually, you know it's wrong. It's ethically wrong, and it's part of why we're dealing with some really inconsistent research findings these days. So it's wrong in every way. Don't do it. Additionally, a push towards replication in the field of psychology has been research labs who are really pushing forward advances in things like larger sample sizes, changing the way that we collect and measure data, so less of these sort of tricky, subtle manipulations or measures and just letting self-report uh, stand on its own, right? Letting people's results speak for themselves. And additionally, within particularly the field of psychology and in social psychology, you're seeing a lot of research labs rededicate a fair amount of their resources just towards replication. So just this one, the Many Labs project that was spearheaded by Brian Nosek, who I believe is at UVA, has systematically undertaken a series of replications where many research labs across the country and across the world will simultaneously try and replicate the same finding. In doing so, they're trying to figure out which old psychology findings are legit and which ones aren't. So what they found is, for example, in one of their Many Labs initiatives, they found they replicated about half of the research studies that they tried to replicate. So what this tells us is that there's a fair amount of psychology research that we can replicate, so we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of psychology research is replicating and we can trust it. And then there's a lot of studies, potentially half, that we really, really need to closely scrutinize. So this might seem like a lot of work. It definitely is, but there are certainly people within the field of psychology who are motivated to help do that work, to repair a lot of the fluky, unreliable research from the history of psychology. And then this issue of, or this idea of replicating your own research, just to show you how the tide is turning on this particular front of self-replication. If you read old articles in, let's say, a top tier journal like the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, you might see that a single paper has researchers replicating a study once, right? A 2 or 3 study package within a single publication. That used to be status quo. Now, if you want to get published in JPSP, you have to go much more above and beyond to get published in such a top tier journal. So, for example, some former students out of a Miami lab who have now gone on to academic careers, a single paper that they did to get published in JPSB on a really cool research area, which is facial perceptions on the extent to which a face we're observing appears human or not as human. It's a really cool research area that has to do with the extent to which we actually fully accept the humanity of another person. One study or one paper that they put together, linked here, well, they started with 5 studies that initially established their primary finding. They then did 2 supplementary studies, again, in this same publication, looking at potential mediators. So they identified and replicated one finding 5 times in a mix of direct and conceptual replications. Then in a couple replication plus extensions, they looked at proposed mechanisms or mediators. And then finally, 3 additional studies sought to add in some potential downstream dependent variables. So again, some more replication plus extension. So replicating their studies with further dependent variables. This single paper contains 10 various replications, all looking at the same similar effect. Publishing in a journal like JPSB these days takes this amount of effort. So despite the fact that this puts a lot more pressure on researchers to spend a lot more time and expend a lot more energy and resources on a single research package, this is all in the service of making our research more consistent and more reliable. So now moving on to the slightly distinct but related issue of research generalizability. So generalizability has to do with the extent to which we believe our research findings could apply to other people, other groups in other places at different times. So this is obviously a related issue to the issue of replication, because if you want to properly generalize your research, you would hope that any of your research findings would replicate to other people. So the question doesn't become, would I find my exact same result again? It's, would I find my exact same results again in different sorts of people? It's not always the case that your results would generalize universally. This is a big world full of lots of different kinds of people, so you do have to interrogate, at least, to whom does it generalize? Would it generalize in different settings, in different places, in different geographical locations? So these are the questions of generalizability. If not, if you think that you have a limited external validity or ability to generalize, you do have to interrogate the extent to which that bothers you. Overall, we do need to pay more attention to these issues of generalizability because there's really a systematic sampling bias within psychological research generally. The vast majority, and I'm talking 90+% of the research that has been done in psychological science has been done on individuals that fit this very specific demographic makeup of Western, educated, industrialized, and rich democratic countries or citizens from these countries. So if you're familiar with the WEIRD acronym, this has to do with the fact that the vast majority of subjects from psychological research fit this exact profile. So this is going to include citizens of the United States, most of Western Europe, potentially Australia, and it's going to exclude all of Asia, all of Africa, most of South America. That's more than half the world being excluded from representation in psychological research. So this finding of the systematic WEIRD bias in psychological research was identified within the past, I think, 20 years or so, and definitely a lot of discussion has ensued on how psychology might have been doing a great job at understanding this person and a garbage job at understanding everyone else. So interrogate internally, and when you're consuming psychological research, if you think this WEIRD bias might be impacting the veracity and validity of our findings. If psychological research is really not trying to understand more than half the world, ask yourself why that might be. Systematic racial biases and cultural biases within the field of psychology? Yeah, absolutely. We definitely need to think harder about why that bias exists, and we need to try and counteract it by more adequately representing people across the world in psychological research. So I'm going to leave you with a few final thoughts that sort of sum up my opinion and advice on how I think going forward you can do your best to be really thoughtful, scientifically minded individuals. Whether or not you do research ever again, after 294, you might never do research again, and that's completely fine. But even if you just go on to be a citizen of the world, you're going to encounter research and you're going to want to be able to wade through the bullshit and do your best to come to good, solid conclusions. One is to be aware of sensationalized research. So much scientific research that you hear about is just the sensationalized, sexy stuff that is almost always overblown. If you hear a claim that sounds too good to be true, rigorously do your own research. Find the original publication. Try and figure out whether or not the mainstream media is misreporting scientific research, because a lot of the time they are. Another thing is to keep in mind that science, it works on a cyclical process, right? The theory data cycle. Science does not sit still. It's supposed to be constantly ongoing. If you hear about a scientific finding that seems to contradict something that you already heard, look into it. Maybe the new finding is legit. Maybe what we used to think was true appears to need to be thrown out the window. Don't discount the validity of psychological science or science generally, given that it's constantly changing, because that's how it's supposed to work. A really simple adage that I know you're all familiar with, which is that correlation doesn't equal causation, right? Make sure that you're very carefully scrutinizing any research results that make overblown causal type claims that seem to be the result of basic correlational research. It seems so simple because we've heard it so often. You will be amazed at how often this simple misconception that correlation does not immediately yield to causational claims is at the heart of a lot of really poor scientific literacy. Overall, just try and be mindful, try and be thoughtful, try and be as empirical and objective as you can. Because really, there is such a market and such a thirst for bullshit science, right? There is just so much bad science and bad interpretations of science out there. Try and do your best to be thoughtful about where you're getting your scientific research. You don't need to be an expert at everything, but really just do your best. Interrogate claims closely. Read from a lot of different experts. Come to your own conclusions. There are people and sources out there that can help you wade through the bullshit. Just to give you one example, I'm not a medical doctor, obviously. So if I'm trying to help figure out what's going on with medical science, I follow medical doctors on Twitter or I read their blogs and I try and get their opinion. I try and figure out what's going on with particular research findings by consulting people that I think will be able to inform me. And then from there, I use my mind and I come to my own conclusions. And I hope you can do the same. So you had a discussion last week, yeehaw, replication, generalizability. It's important. Oh my God, thank God. That is my last lecture for 294 and in general. So, hell yeah. I hope you guys are staying safe and that you don't have coronavirus. I hope you had a good semester. I had a good-ish semester. Yeah, I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you guys later.